Welcome to AP U.S. History Unit 2. This unit is all about colonies in America, first what their purpose was, and then how they evolved. This unit is worth 6 to 8% on your AP exam, so once again, other units you might want to study a little harder, but make sure to study this one a fair bit too. This video is simply a clipped together video of all my Unit 2 topic review videos without the AP style questions. If you'd like to try your hand at the AP style questions, you'll have to watch the specific topic review videos. Enough of me babbling though. Let's get into Unit 2. Topic 2.2 is about not just Spanish efforts in the New World, but the French, Dutch, and British efforts as well. So I should preface this all by saying that the Spanish were not the only ones in the New World, though they were the forerunners. Other European countries came in too after hearing of the riches of the New World. Let's start with a little review on the Spanish. So the Spanish find the New World and try to enslave the natives under the encomienda system. This, however, faced criticism throughout the country, so in some areas they replaced their system to the repartimiento system, which was supposed to be less exploitive and for shorter periods. But it still led to horrid conditions for the natives. In an attempt to justify their colonization, the Spanish forcefully converted a fair amount of the natives to Christianity. And after the slavery of the natives didn't really work, they transported slaves from Africa and enslaved them to work under a system called asiento. Okay, that's the Spanish's way in the New World. Now let's talk about the French and the Dutch. They were a lot nicer to the natives and sent few Europeans to the continent and attempted to make trade alliances along with marry some of the natives in an attempt to build economic and diplomatic relations to export products like furs to Europe. With the French making their Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, and the Dutch continuing to build their fur trade empire through strategic alliances focused on cooperation. And finally, the English. English men and women migrants like John Smith and John Winthrop were attracted to the New World for 4 reasons. First was social mobility, as they believed they could potentially raise their social standing moving to the New World. Next was economic prosperity, as colonists believed the Americas were a gold mine where they could potentially grow wealthy from. Third was religious freedom, as groups like Puritans, Pilgrims, and Quakers were being persecuted in Europe, and especially England, causing them to seek new grounds to worship freely. And finally, improved living conditions, as the colonies offered a new life and new opportunity that could be better than living in Europe. Once the colonists moved to the New World, English settlers often took land from the Native Americans, sometimes through treaties, but more often through force. And the colonies they created centered their economies on agriculture, but more on that next. So we're gonna have some fun with this video, all about British colonies and how they functioned. But before we get to that, I need to tell you about English arrival into the New World. So the British come into the New World and expect to find vast amounts of gold in Virginia and along the Atlantic coast. This ends up not happening, but the Americas still offered the British cash crops like tobacco and rice, so they end up making farms in their various colonies. The people on these farms were mostly indentured servants, who were English workmen and women that in exchange for passage to the New World, they would have to work the land for a set number of years, which would normally average around 7. Now this worked for a while, but after a while there was a shortage of indentured servants, along with the growth of African slavery, which inevitably caused indentured servitude to fail. Now, to talk about the British colonies, I have for you a random woman I paid off a $5 to voice over this part of the video.
After Britain settled in America, they set up colonies, and most of them were crucial to the foundation of America. The colonies in the Chesapeake Bay and North Carolina grew prosperous due to tobacco exports. They initially relied on indentured servants for labor, but then shifted to enslaved Africans because of the failure of indentured servitude, as Max should have mentioned earlier.
Cheers, mate.
The British colonies in New England were settled by the Puritans. They developed around small towns with family farms. The biggest thing about these colonies was that they thrived on agriculture and commerce. The middle colonies saw a collection of diversity within ethnicities and religions,
like the Huguenots from France and the Quakers mentioned last video,
therefore leading to various levels of tolerance. Finally, the Southern Atlantic and British West Indies colonies were known for their farming. They utilized long growing seasons for plantation economies based on a stable crop. Don't be fooled though, most of the labor, or more specifically farming done in these colonies was done by African slaves. These colonies would form governments of their own with elite planters holding local authority and the formations of specific governments based on elected assemblies.
Cheers, mate. One thing to notice is how unusually democratic British colonies at this time were. Like the New England colonies ran on town meetings and the southern colonists were ran by elite planters with elected assemblies.
which were basically unheard of at the time. The most notable of all is to talk about the Chesapeake Bay colonies, with a special emphasis on the town of Jamestown in Virginia, which was the first official permanent English settlement in 1607, and was easily the most popular of all English colonies, with its tobacco exports and its unique government style. And that is all. Topic 2.4 is all about the transatlantic trade. The main thing to take away from all of this is all Europeans really wanted from the New World was profit. Crops in the New World were so unbelievably profitable by the Europeans that, heck, there's an argument that without the crop of sugar, there is no African slave trade. And as goods and slaves were being transported, a system of trade known as the triangular trade, where European ships carried manufactured goods such as guns, cloth, and alcohol to Africa in exchange for African slaves to be transported to the New World and have them undergo the Middle Passage, which saw Africans chained and tightly cramped together in ships to the New World. And finally, in the Americas, the enslaved Africans were sold and the ships were loaded with raw materials such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were then transported back to Europe. As you can see, this way of trade resembles a triangle, which is why it's known as the triangular trade. This trade would also cause diseases like smallpox to be spread to the New World and syphilis to be spread to Europe. Meanwhile, in North American colonies, the British government continuously attempted to incorporate their monarchical and hierarchical structure in the colonies for the point of earning the most wealth, which would inevitably receive pushback from the colonists and the American Indians, with one such example being the Bacon's Rebellion, where after the governor of Virginia refused to expel the Native Americans from Virginia, a man named Nathaniel Bacon rebelled and with a group of around 400 followers tried to overturn that decision and kill the natives. Although the British suppressed this rebellion, it highlighted the potential for colonists to revolt, foreshadowing the larger conflicts that would lead to the American Revolution. Topic 2.5 is all about the interactions between Native Americans and Europeans and how it changed from my last video on topic 1.6. The basic thing to know is that even before European contact, Native American tribes always fought each other. Now we start seeing Native American groups ally with European countries in an attempt to once again fight against other tribes. But even though this did happen, we still see Europeans expand and encroach on Native American land, with a prime example being Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War, which was the bloodiest battle in American history relative to the population of the time. This war started because English colonists broke treaties made with the natives and continued to forcefully expand past the natives' land, and with the killings of a few people along with some other reasons, the war began. King Philip was with the Native Americans and fought against the colonists along with a few Native American tribes. In the end, it was said that over 7,000 people died, and the colonists ended up winning. The effect of the end of this war was the sort of end of Native American power in the New England colonies. Though most all Native American resistances failed, there were a few that succeeded. One of which was the Pueblo Revolt, where the indigenous Pueblo peoples successfully revolted against the Spanish. The aftermath of this was that it led to the Spanish accommodation of some aspects of American Indian culture in the Southwest. But this would end not really mattering, as decades later the Spanish would end up taking the land of the Pueblo peoples. We already know that there was a shortage of indentured servants, and therefore the British started participating in the African slave trade. The system that African slaves were employed under the Spanish was called asiento, but in English colonies they were employed under a separate system known as chattel slavery, where slaves were treated as property and not people. These African slaves worked heavily in the Chesapeake Bay and southern Atlantic coast, but the majority of them were in the West Indies. As chattel slavery became dominant, the interracial relationships between colonists and slaves became illegal, which made Africans only breed with other Africans, and new laws were put in place that their children would automatically be slaves. I know, it's awful. But even with this level of hopelessness, some Africans rebelled, with an example being the First Maroon War. But most that didn't rebel tried to survive by maintaining their own people's culture. One example of this being the Gala community, which maintained African traditions such as dancing to West African music during their rare moments of relaxation. That's all. I've talked a lot on slavery and the African slave trade in colonies, and it's because that slavery was a massive aspect of colonies. In topic 2.7, we move away from the connotation of slavery and talk about other societies' cultures. The fact is, in all European colonies, there existed lots of different religions and ethnic groups, causing acceptance of diversity in colonies, and the word for that is pluralism,
along with varying degrees of intellectual exchange. European leaders saw their colonies in the Americas as moneymakers and nothing else. The actual truth was that these colonies made their own unique culture and way of democratic governance. European leaders continued to clash with their colonies on things like the Navigation Acts, which lowered trade with their colonies and ended up hurting the colonies. The Enlightenment also started in Europe, which was an intellectual movement of reason and science. This would have a heavy influence on colonists later when the revolution would start with the ideas like freedom of religion and equality. But in this video, all you need to know is the initial response to the Enlightenment in the colonies, which was the First Great Awakening. This occurred in the colonies, where it saw the revival of Christianity in the British 13 colonies. This Christianity was traditionally the British's form, being Anglicanism, but it shifted throughout decades in the First Great Awakening to branches of Protestantism like Baptists and Methodists. We also see a rise in the spread of Protestant evangelicalism. The transatlantic trade culture also started in the colonies, where you start seeing the communication via press. The fact is that this culture had a different way of life, government, and reason that differed from European thought. Europeans didn't really like this and frequently clashed with their colonies. That, however, is something to talk about next unit. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check the description for some more help, and I'll see you in Unit 3.